Grace Mitchell stood in the antiseptic quiet of Providence Portland Medical Center's palliative care wing, holding a manila envelope that an attorney had just placed in her hands. And through the fourth-floor windows, she could see October rain turning the Pearl District into a watercolor blur of gray and amber. Could see the city where she'd spent 41 years moving through routines that felt increasingly like going through motions. And the attorney was saying something about inheritance and legal challenges, and the fact that Arthur Whitmore, the elderly patient who died 2 weeks ago after 6 months under Grace's care, had left his entire $47 million estate to her, to a hospice nurse he'd supposedly just met, to a woman who'd done nothing except her job, who'd provided comfort during dying, the way she'd provided comfort to hundreds of patients over 2 decades of nursing. And Grace couldn't make the words make sense, couldn't reconcile the quiet old man who'd spent his final months reading mysteries and watching rain and talking to her about nothing in particular with someone who'd had $47 million, who'd apparently had no family to inherit it, who'd chosen to leave his fortune to the nurse who'd changed his sheets and monitored his morphine and sat with him during the long nights when pain made sleep impossible and fear made solitude unbearable. The attorney was named David Park, middle-aged and careful in the way lawyers were when delivering news that would change lives and probably trigger lawsuits, and he explained that Arthur Whitmore had been a commercial property developer who'd made his fortune in the 80s and 90s, building office complexes and retail centers across the Pacific Northwest, that he'd been widowed 20 years ago and had lived alone since then, that he'd revised his will 3 months before his death to name Grace Mitchell as sole beneficiary, leaving her not just money, but property and investments, and a legacy that came with complications she couldn't yet imagine. Grace listened to these facts, while her mind kept circling back to Arthur, to the old man who'd seemed so ordinary, so unremarkable, just another terminal patient facing death, with the kind of quiet resignation that came from accepting the inevitable, from understanding that some battles couldn't be won, no matter how much medicine or money or prayer you threw at them. She'd been assigned to Arthur's care in April, had walked into his private room expecting another routine case, another dying person who needed symptom management and comfort measures, and someone to witness their final chapter without judgment or false optimism. And she'd found instead a man who'd seemed genuinely interested in her, who'd asked about her life and her son and her late husband, who'd listened with the kind of attention that was rare in any relationship but almost unheard of between patient and nurse, between someone dying and someone whose job was simply to ease the transition. They talked during her shifts, conversations that ranged from trivial observations about hospital food to deeper discussions about loss and meaning and what people left behind when they died. And Arthur had been surprisingly philosophical for someone who claimed to have spent his life building shopping centers, had quoted poetry and referenced books, and demonstrated the kind of educated thoughtfulness that didn't match his story about being a simple developer who'd gotten lucky with real estate timing. Grace had liked him, had looked forward to her shifts in his room, had found herself staying longer than necessary to finish conversations that felt important even though she couldn't explain why a dying stranger's opinions about her life mattered so much. And when Arthur had died 2 weeks ago on a quiet Tuesday morning with Grace holding his hand, she'd cried the way she rarely let herself cry for patients anymore, had mourned him with the particular grief that came from losing someone who'd seen you clearly, who'd treated you like you mattered, who'd made you feel less invisible than you'd become over the years since your husband had died, saving strangers from a burning apartment building, and left you alone to raise a teenage son and figure out how to keep living when the person who'd made life worthwhile was gone. David Park was explaining something about distant relatives who were contesting the will, cousins Arthur hadn't spoken to in decades, who were now claiming that Grace must have exercised undue influence, must have manipulated a vulnerable dying man into leaving her his fortune, must have done something unethical or illegal, because why else would a wealthy recluse disinherit his blood family in favor of a hospice nurse he'd known for 6 months? The attorney said the case was was weak, that Arthur had been mentally sharp until his final days, that multiple witnesses could testify to his competence, but that probate litigation could drag on for months, could make Grace's inheritance uncertain, could transform what should have been a gift into a legal battle that would cost money and time and emotional energy she wasn't sure she had to spare. Grace asked if she could refuse the inheritance, if she could simply disclaim it and let it go to Arthur's relatives and avoid the whole mess. And David Park looked at her with an expression that suggested he didn't often encounter beneficiaries who wanted to give away $47 million. He said she could disclaim it, that was her legal right, but that Arthur had left her something else, something that couldn't be disclaimed or refused or passed to other heirs. And he pulled a smaller envelope from his briefcase, cream-colored and sealed with red wax that looked old-fashioned, deliberate, important in a way that suggested ceremony rather than simple correspondence. The attorney explained that Arthur had left instructions that this letter should be delivered to Grace privately, should be read before she made any decisions about the inheritance, should be considered carefully because it contained information that Arthur believed would help her understand why he'd chosen her, why the money mattered, why accepting it was important in ways that had nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with debts that could only be paid through inheritance. David Park stood and said he'd give Grace privacy to read the letter, said she should call him after she'd processed its contents, said that regardless of what Arthur had written, the decision about the inheritance was ultimately hers, but that he hoped she'd at least consider accepting it because in his 40 years of estate law, he'd never seen a testator more intentional about his final wishes, more certain that his beneficiary deserved what he was leaving her. Grace sat alone in the small consultation room with the sealed envelope in her hands, and she thought about Arthur lying in that hospital bed, his body failing, but his mind sharp, his eyes always watching her with an intensity she'd attributed to the particular awareness that dying brought, the way terminal patients sometimes seemed to see through surface to essence, to understand things about people that normal social interaction obscured. She told Arthur things she rarely told anyone, had talked about her husband Michael's death 3 years ago, about the way grief had hollowed her out, about her son Tyler struggling through high school without his father, about the particular loneliness of being a widow at 38, too young to give up on living, but too exhausted by loss to imagine building a new life that could compare to what she'd lost. And if stories like this speak to you in any way, make sure to subscribe now, because every narrative here hides a truth no one sees coming, and I want you with me for every revelation. She broke the wax seal and unfolded pages covered in Arthur's careful handwriting, the same script she'd seen on the mystery novel bookmarks he'd made, on the thank you notes he'd written to nurses who'd brought him decent coffee or adjusted his pillows or simply sat with him when pain made sleep impossible. The letter began with an apology, with Arthur acknowledging that what he was about to reveal would be shocking, possibly devastating, certainly life-changing in ways that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the particular tragedy of missed connections, lost opportunities, relationships that should have existed but were prevented by pride or fear or the choices people made when they were young and foolish and convinced that they had time to fix their mistakes later, when later turned out to be never. Arthur wrote that he'd known who Grace was before he'd been admitted to hospice care, had specifically requested Providence, Portland, because he'd learned she worked there, had fabricated symptoms and exaggerated decline to ensure he'd be assigned to palliative care, where Grace would be his nurse, where he'd have 6 months to know her, to understand her, to witness the person his son had loved enough to marry, to build a life with, to leave behind when he'd died being heroic in ways Arthur had never managed. Grace stopped reading, reread that sentence 3 times, and she felt something like ice spreading through her chest because Arthur was saying he'd known Michael, was claiming some connection to her dead husband, and she couldn't make it make sense. Couldn't reconcile the old man she'd cared for with anyone who would have known Michael Mitchell, firefighter, hero, man who died at 35 saving children from a burning building while Arthur Whitmore had been a alive and wealthy and apparently aware that Michael existed. She forced herself to keep reading, and Arthur explained that he was Michael's biological father, that he'd gotten a woman pregnant when he was 19 and stupid and terrified of the responsibility that fatherhood required, and he'd left, had disappeared, had paid monthly child support through anonymous channels, but had never made contact, had never met his son, had let Michael grow up believing his father was nobody, was someone who'd rejected him before birth, was irrelevant to the life Michael built despite that absence. Arthur wrote that he'd regretted it immediately, had wanted to go back and claim his son, but that years had passed and the window for explaining had closed, and he'd convinced himself that Michael was better off without him, that a father who'd abandoned his child couldn't suddenly reappear and expect forgiveness, that the damage had been done and trying to repair it would only create more pain. But Arthur had watched from a distance, had tracked Michael's life through private investigators and careful research, had been present at Michael's high school graduation, standing in the back of the auditorium, had been at Michael's fire academy ceremony, had even attended Michael and Grace's wedding, hidden among the crowd of guests. And he'd been proud of the man his son had become, proud that Michael had chosen a life of service, proud that he'd found Grace and built a family and become the kind of father Arthur had failed to be. Arthur wrote that he'd been in Portland the day Michael died, had been in the crowd watching the apartment building burn, had seen his son run into the flames one final time to search for children who were trapped on the 3rd floor, had watched the building collapse, had understood that Michael was dead before the official announcement came, and he'd stood there on the street with smoke in his lungs and tears on his face, and the knowledge that his son had died being brave, while Arthur had spent his entire life being a coward. Grace's hands were shaking so hard the letter was difficult to read, and she felt nausea rising in her throat because this meant that Arthur had known exactly who she was when he'd been admitted to hospice, had known she was his son's widow, had manipulated the situation to get close to her, had spent 6 months essentially spying on her under the guise of being a dying patient who needed care. She felt betrayed, felt used, felt like the conversations they'd had and the grief she'd shared and the genuine affection she'd developed for him had all been founded on lies, on manipulation, on Arthur's need to assuage his guilt by getting close to the woman his son had loved, since he couldn't get close to his son himself. But the letter continued, and Arthur wrote that meeting Grace hadn't been about manipulation, had been about understanding, about seeing what kind of person his son had chosen, about witnessing the love that had shaped Michael's adult life. And Arthur had discovered that Grace was remarkable, was kind and thoughtful and strong in ways that made Arthur understand why Michael had loved her, why he'd married her, why he'd built his life around her. Arthur wrote that the 6 months in hospice care had been the happiest of his life, not because dying was pleasant, but because he'd finally known his son through the person who'd known Michael best, had finally understood what he'd missed, what he'd sacrificed when he'd chosen to stay away, and that understanding had been both devastating and necessary, had shown Arthur exactly what his cowardice had cost him and what it had cost Michael to grow up without a father. Grace left the hospital consultation room and drove home through rain that had intensified into the kind of October storm that Portland sent to remind people that winter was coming, that the brief reprieve of summer was over, that months of gray awaited anyone foolish enough to believe the sun would return before spring. She lived in a small house in southeast Portland, a 1920s bungalow she and Michael had bought when they were newlyweds, with more optimism than money, planning to renovate it slowly as they could afford materials and time. But after Michael's death, Grace had lost interest in home improvement, had let the house remain frozen in whatever state of partial completion Michael had left it in, as if changing anything would erase the last evidence of his presence, his hands, his vision for what their home could become. Tyler was in the kitchen when she arrived, her 16-year-old son who looked more like his father every day, same dark hair and broad shoulders, and the particular intensity that came from caring too much about everything, from feeling the world's injustices personally rather than abstractly. He asked about her day in the careful tone he'd developed since his father died, the voice of someone who'd learned early that adults were fragile, that his mother in particular was barely holding together, that asking too directly about how she was doing might shatter whatever composure she'd managed to construct. Grace said her day had been strange, that something unexpected had happened, and she showed him the attorney's business card, told him about Arthur Whitmore's inheritance, about the $47 million that a dying patient had left to her for reasons she was only beginning to understand. Tyler's expression shifted from concern to confusion to something that looked like suspicion, and he asked why a patient would leave his nurse millions of dollars, whether Grace had done something inappropriate, whether there was a reason to feel uncomfortable about this inheritance. And Grace recognized in his questions the particular protectiveness that children develop toward widowed parents, the sense that they needed to guard against predators, against people who might take advantage of grief or loneliness or the vulnerability that came from rebuilding life after loss. She told him there was more to the story, that Arthur hadn't been a random patient, that there was a connection between them that she'd only just discovered, and she handed him Arthur's letter with hands that still trembled from reading it herself, with awareness that what she was about to share would rewrite Tyler's understanding of his father's history, his grandfather's absence, his own origin story. Tyler read the letter slowly, his face going through expressions that Grace recognized from her own reading, shock and confusion and anger, and finally something that looked like grief, like mourning for a grandfather he'd never known existed, for relationships that could have been but were prevented by choices made decades before Tyler was born. He asked if it was true, if Arthur Whitmore had really been his grandfather, if the old man Grace had cared for had been family, had been blood, had been watching them from a distance the way the letter claimed, and Grace said she didn't know for certain, but that she believed it, that Arthur's knowledge of Michael's life, his specific details about their wedding and Tyler's birth, and moments that only family would know about, suggested that he'd been telling the truth, that he'd been connected to them in ways Grace hadn't recognized because she hadn't been looking for connection, hadn't imagined that a dying patient might be her late husband's father. Tyler asked why Arthur had stayed away, why he'd never contacted Michael, why he'd let his son grow up without a father when he'd apparently been alive and wealthy and capable of providing everything Michael had needed. And Grace said she didn't know, that the letter suggested regret but didn't fully explain the original abandonment, didn't justify decades of absence, didn't make adequate amends for letting Michael believe he was unwanted when his father had apparently been watching him, had been proud of him, had been present at major moments even if that presence had been hidden, secret, insufficient. Tyler said it wasn't fair, said Michael had deserved better, said that knowing his father had a parent who'd chosen not to be present made his dad's death seem even more tragic, more wasteful, because Michael had died at 35 while his own father had lived into his 80s, had gotten decades that Michael would never have, had squandered time that Michael would have used to watch Tyler grow up, to be present, to be the father that Arthur had failed to be. Grace held her son while he cried, and she thought about inheritance, about what gets passed down through generations, about how Arthur's abandonment of Michael had shaped Michael's determination to be present, to be engaged, to be the kind of father who coached Little League and attended school plays and made time for his son even when fire department shifts were exhausting and money was tight, and being a good father required sacrificing the personal time that other men used for hobbies or relaxation. Michael had broken the pattern of absence, had chosen presence, had been such a devoted father that his death had left a hole in Tyler's life that 3 years hadn't begun to fill, and Grace understood that Michael's fathering had been partly reaction to his own father's absence, partly determination that his son would never feel the abandonment that Michael had carried his entire life. She made dinner they barely ate, and they sat at the kitchen table talking about what to do with Arthur's revelation, whether to accept the inheritance or refuse it. whether money could somehow make amends for abandonment, or whether accepting it would feel like forgiving Arthur for choices that didn't deserve forgiveness, that couldn't be excused by late-life guilt or deathbed generosity. Tyler said they should refuse it, said his dad would have refused it, said that taking money from a grandfather who'd never bothered to meet his grandson felt wrong, felt like accepting payment for something that shouldn't be transactional, like monetizing grief or loss, or the hole that Michael's absence had left in both their lives. But Grace thought about Arthur's letter, about the specific language he'd used, about his insistence that the inheritance wasn't about paying them off, but about providing for Michael's family the way Arthur should have provided for Michael, about giving Tyler opportunities that Michael's death had made uncertain, about ensuring that Michael's son could go to college and build a life without the financial struggle that Grace and Michael had faced when they were young and starting out with more hope than resources. She thought about her nursing salary, about the money she'd saved for Tyler's college that would cover maybe 2 years of state school tuition if they were careful, about the student loans Tyler would probably need to take out, about the financial stress that was always present beneath their daily routines, the calculation of whether they could afford new shoes or a school trip, or the expensive calculator Tyler's math teacher recommended. Grace told Tyler that she didn't think they should decide immediately, that they needed time to process Arthur's revelation, to understand what accepting or refusing would mean, to consider whether the inheritance was really about them or whether it was about Arthur's need for redemption, whether they owed his ghost anything or whether their obligation was only to themselves, to Michael's memory, to the life they were trying to build from the wreckage of sudden widowhood and early orphaning. Tyler agreed reluctantly, said he needed to think, needed to figure out how he felt about having a grandfather who'd existed but stayed hidden, who'd attended his father's wedding but not his father's funeral, who'd known about Tyler but never sent a birthday card or made contact or acknowledged that his grandson existed. The next morning, Grace called David Park and told him she needed access to Arthur's property, needed to see where he'd lived, needed to understand more about who he'd been before she could decide about the inheritance, and the attorney said he could arrange that, could give her keys to Arthur's loft in the Pearl District, could let her spend time in the space Arthur had occupied for the 20 years since his wife's death. Grace drove there alone, left Tyler at school, and she stood in front of a converted warehouse building that had been transformed into expensive lofts, the kind of place that symbolized Portland's gentrification, its transformation from working-class port city to destination for tech workers and creative professionals and people who could afford $15 cocktails and artisanal everything. Arthur's loft was on the top floor, windows overlooking the Willamette River and the bridges that connected East and West Portland, and Grace let herself in with the keys David Park had provided, and she stepped into a space that took her breath away, not because it was luxurious, though it was, but because it was a shrine, was a museum, was evidence of obsession or devotion or the particular madness that comes from loving someone from a distance, from watching a life you can't participate in, from building your existence around the edges of someone else's story. The walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, and Grace moved closer and saw that they were all of Michael, were documentation of her late husband's entire life from infancy through his death at 35, were proof that Arthur had been watching constantly, had been present for everything even when his presence had been invisible, had been unacknowledged, had been the particular absence that shapes people more than presence ever could. There were photos of Michael as a baby, as a toddler, elementary school pictures and middle school awkwardness and high school sports teams, and Grace recognized some of them from the albums Michael's mother had kept, but others were new, were taken from distance or angle that suggested Arthur had been in the crowd, had been at the events, had been watching his son grow up from whatever safe distance kept him hidden, kept him secret, kept him from having to explain why he'd been absent for years before suddenly appearing. There were photos of Michael's Fire Academy graduation, of his first day at Station 21, of him in full gear responding to calls, and Grace understood that Arthur must have followed fire department activity property, must have monitored dispatch reports, must have shown up at scenes where his son was working so he could photograph Michael being the hero that Arthur had never been. And there were photos of Grace, of her and Michael together, their engagement party and wedding and honeymoon in Cannon Beach, and Grace felt violation mixing with grief because Arthur had been at their wedding, had been among the guests, had witnessed their vows and their first dance, and the particular joy that came from promising forever to someone you loved. And he'd done it secretly, had done it without introduction or acknowledgement or explanation, had stolen those moments because he'd forfeited his right to participate in them legitimately. There were photos of Tyler's birth, of Michael holding his newborn son outside the hospital, of the three of them as a family during those early, exhausting, wonderful months when new parents learned to function on no sleep and more love than they'd known was possible. And Grace realized that Arthur had been there too, had been watching, had been documenting his son's transformation into father, had been witnessing the kind of devoted parenting that Arthur had denied Michael, had been seeing through his camera lens what he'd missed through his choices. But the most devastating photos were the ones from the day Michael died, from the apartment building fire that had killed him, and Arthur had been there, had been in the crowd, had photographed his son in turnout gear entering the building, had captured the moment of collapse, had recorded the aftermath when firefighters pulled Michael's body from the rubble, and Grace felt rage building in her chest because what kind of person photographed their son's death? What kind of father stood behind a camera instead of running forward, instead of trying to help, instead of being present in the only way that mattered when someone you loved was dying? She found herself crying, standing in Arthur's loft, surrounded by evidence of his surveillance, his obsession, his particular way of loving that looked nothing like love, that was actually just voyeurism, just witnessing without participation, just watching someone's life unfold from safe distance that required nothing, risked nothing, offered nothing except the cold comfort of documentation. She was about to leave, about to walk out of the loft and call David Park and refuse the inheritance and cut all connection to Arthur Whitmore and his guilt and his money and his inadequate attempts to make amends after death, when she noticed a door she'd missed initially, a room beyond the main living space, and she opened it to find what looked like an office, a desk and filing cabinets and shelves full of binders organized by year, and she pulled down the binder labeled with the year. Michael died, and inside were not just photographs, but documents, reports, newspaper clippings, and tucked into a sleeve was a letter addressed to Grace Mitchell in Arthur's handwriting, dated 2 weeks after Michael's funeral, and she opened it with hands that shook because she understood somehow that this letter would be different from the one David Park had given her, would contain truth that Arthur had been too afraid or too ashamed to share while he was alive, would explain something about that day, about the fire, about why Arthur had been there photographing instead of helping, about what exactly he'd witnessed when his son had died. The letter was written in Arthur's careful script, but the handwriting wavered in places, shook in ways that suggested he'd been crying while writing, had been barely able to see through tears or grief, or the particular devastation that comes from witnessing your child's death and understanding that you bear responsibility not just for missing his life, but for the circumstances that led to his final moments. Arthur wrote that he needed to tell Grace the truth about the day Michael died, about what had really happened in that burning apartment building, about why he'd been there and what he'd seen, and the guilt that had consumed him every moment since. The knowledge that his son had died because of Arthur's choices, because of decisions made decades earlier that had created consequences. Neither of them could have predicted when Arthur had walked away from his pregnant girlfriend at 19 and convinced himself that abandonment was acceptable, was survivable, was something a child could overcome without lasting damage. Arthur explained that the apartment building that had burned, the one where Michael had died saving children, had been owned by one of Arthur's companies, was part of his commercial property portfolio that he'd built over 40 years of development work, and he'd known for months before the fire that the building had code violations, had electrical problems that needed addressing, had been cited by inspectors who demanded repairs that Arthur's property management company had been slow to implement because the tenants were low income, because the building barely broke even financially, because spending money on infrastructure didn't generate returns the way that his luxury developments did. Arthur had approved budget for the repairs, but had put them on a timeline that prioritized his more profitable properties, had delayed the electrical work that inspectors said was urgent, had calculated that the risk of fire was low enough that a few more months wouldn't matter, that the violations could wait while his company focused on projects that actually made money. The fire had started on a Tuesday afternoon in August. Electrical malfunction in a third-floor unit that had been flagged by inspectors, that should have been repaired months earlier, that would have been repaired if Arthur had prioritized safety over profit, if he'd understood that code violations in low-income housing mattered as much as code compliance in his expensive downtown towers, if he'd treated the lives of poor tenants with the same concern he showed for wealthy ones. Arthur had been in Portland that day for a development meeting, had heard about the fire on the radio, had driven to the scene without knowing it was his building, without understanding that the emergency he was approaching was connected to him, was caused by him, was his responsibility in ways that went beyond ownership into culpability, into criminal negligence, into the kind of guilt that destroys people from the inside out. He'd arrived as fire trucks were surrounding the building, as smoke was pouring from upper floor windows, and he'd recognized the address immediately, had understood that this was his property, his building, his electrical violations that were causing this fire, and he'd stood in the crowd watching firefighters work with growing horror as he understood that people were dying, that children were trapped, that his decision to delay repairs was killing people in real time while he stood powerless to stop it. And then he'd seen Michael, had recognized his son in turnout gear coordinating the rescue efforts, had watched him make the decision to enter the building one final time because witnesses reported children on the third floor, near the unit where the fire had started, where the electrical problems Arthur had known about for months had finally ignited in ways that were consuming the building faster than firefighters could control. Arthur had wanted to stop him, had wanted to run forward and grab his son and tell him not to go back in, that the building wasn't worth it, that no life was worth risking his own. But Arthur had no standing to intervene, had no relationship with Michael that would make his warnings meaningful, had no right to suddenly appear after 35 years of absence and try to protect his son from danger that Arthur himself had created through negligence and cost-cutting and the kind of casual cruelty that came from treating poor people's housing as low priority, as acceptable risk, as something that could wait because the tenants couldn't afford lawyers or political influence or the kind of advocacy that made property owners take safety seriously. He'd watched Michael enter the building, had photographed it because documenting felt like the only action available to him, because bearing witness seemed like the least he could do when he couldn't bear to look away, couldn't leave, couldn't stop watching, even though every second felt like torture, like punishment, like exactly what he deserved for being the kind of person who'd abandoned his son and then decades later created the conditions that would kill him. Arthur had been standing there with his camera when the building collapsed, when the third floor gave way and brought the roof down with it, when Michael and the children he'd been searching for were buried under brick and timber and the accumulated weight of Arthur's failures as father and as human being. Grace read this with tears streaming down her face and rage building in her chest because Arthur hadn't just been an absent father, he'd been the reason Michael was dead, had created the emergency that had killed him, had prioritized profit over safety in ways that had directly resulted in his son's death. She thought about Michael's funeral, about standing beside his grave with Tyler clinging to her while the fire department played bagpipes and presented her with a folded flag, about the speeches calling Michael a hero, about the mayor saying that Portland was safer because of men like Michael Mitchell who ran toward danger when everyone else ran away. And she wanted to scream that Michael had died not because of heroism, but because of negligence, because some property owner had cut corners, because someone had decided that electrical repairs in a poor neighborhood could wait, because Arthur Whitmore had valued profit over people and had ended up killing his own son through that calculation. The letter continued, and Arthur wrote that he'd tried to turn himself in, had gone to the fire marshal's office prepared to confess that the fire was his fault, that the code violations were his responsibility, that he should be charged with criminally negligent homicide for creating conditions that had killed Michael and 3 children who hadn't been rescued in time, who died in the collapse alongside the firefighter who'd been trying to save them. But the fire marshal's investigation had concluded that the fire was accidental, that while code violations had contributed to its severity, the original electrical malfunction wasn't something inspections could have prevented, that the building owner's delayed repairs were civil violations rather than criminal negligence, that there was no basis for charging anyone with the deaths that had occurred because sometimes fires happened, sometimes people died, sometimes tragedy was just tragedy rather than crime. Arthur had been advised by his attorneys not to accept responsibility publicly, not to admit fault, not to say anything that could be used in civil litigation by families of the victims, and he'd followed that advice because following advice was what wealthy people did when they wanted to avoid consequences, when they wanted to insulate themselves from the damage their choices caused, when they valued their own protection more than truth or justice or the acknowledgement that their actions had destroyed lives. The families of the children who died had sued Arthur's company, had settled for undisclosed amounts that Arthur's insurance had covered, had signed non-disclosure agreements that prevented them from speaking publicly about the code violations or the delayed repairs or the fact that their children had died because a property owner had prioritized his bottom line over their safety. But Michael's death had destroyed Arthur in ways that lawsuits couldn't, had broken something fundamental in him, had made him understand that his entire life had been a series of failures, compounded by cowardice, by choosing profit over principle, by abandoning his son, and then decades later creating the conditions that would kill him. Arthur had tried to tell Grace, had drafted letters explaining what had happened, had started to call her dozens of times, but had always stopped, because what could he possibly say that would make any of this better? What words could explain or excuse or make sense of the fact that he'd been responsible for Michael's death, that his negligence had created the fire that had made Michael a hero, that the man Grace had loved and lost had died fixing Arthur's mistakes, had died because Arthur had failed in every possible way that fathers and property owners and human beings could fail. So Arthur had done nothing, had said nothing, had stayed hidden and guilty and consumed by grief that he couldn't share, because sharing it would require explaining his connection to Michael, would require admitting that he was Michael's father, would require revealing that the fire had been caused by his code violations, and he couldn't bear to add that pain to what Grace was already suffering, couldn't bear to tell a widow that her husband had died because of his father's negligence, that the hero's death she was mourning was actually preventable tragedy caused by someone who should have loved Michael enough to keep him safe, but had instead loved money more than his own child's life. Arthur had lived with that guilt for 3 years, had let it eat him alive, had developed the cancer that eventually killed him. Though he said in the letter that he suspected the cancer was psychosomatic, was his body's way of punishing him for sins his conscience couldn't adequately address, was the physical manifestation of guilt that had no outlet, no redemption, no way to make amends. When his cancer diagnosis came, Arthur had seen it as opportunity, as chance to finally approach Grace, to finally know something about his son through the person Michael had loved, and he'd checked himself into hospice care specifically to be near her, to be cared for by her, to spend his final months understanding who Michael had been through the eyes of someone who'd actually known him, who'd loved him, who could tell Arthur things about his son that surveillance photos couldn't capture. Arthur wrote that the 6 months in hospice care had been both torture and gift. Torture because every conversation with Grace reminded him of what he'd lost. What he'd thrown away when he'd abandoned Michael, what he'd destroyed when his negligence had killed him, but gift because he'd finally understood who his son had been, what kind of man he'd become, how he'd loved Grace and Tyler, how he'd been the father Arthur should have been, how he'd broken the pattern of abandonment and chosen presence, chosen service, chosen to be the kind of person who ran toward danger to save strangers' children, while his own father had spent his life running away from anything that required courage or sacrifice or the kind of love that costs something. Arthur wrote that he was leaving his fortune to Grace, not because money could compensate for what he'd taken from her, not because $47 million could replace Michael or give Tyler back his father or undo 3 years of grief and struggle, but because it was literally the only thing he had left to give, the only way he could make any kind of amends, however inadequate, the only path to ensuring that Michael's family would be provided for in ways that Arthur had never provided for. Michael himself, he said the money came from the sale of his company after the fire, that he'd liquidated his commercial property portfolio because he couldn't bear to own buildings anymore, couldn't bear to be responsible for tenants' safety when he'd proven he couldn't be trusted with that responsibility, couldn't stomach collecting rent from people whose lives he'd demonstrated he didn't value appropriately. The inheritance was Michael's, Arthur wrote, was what should have gone to Michael if Michael had lived, was the patrimony that every son deserved from his father, and since Michael was dead because of Arthur's failures, the inheritance should go to Michael's family, should provide for Grace and Tyler, should ensure that Michael's death at least resulted in security for the people he'd loved, should create something positive from tragedy that had been entirely Arthur's fault. He wrote that he understood Grace might refuse the inheritance once she knew the truth, might not want money that came from the man whose negligence had killed her husband, might prefer poverty to accepting blood money from someone who'd failed Michael in every possible way, but that he hoped she'd consider accepting it for Tyler's sake, for Michael's sake, for the future that Michael would have wanted for his son, even if that future came funded by the father who destroyed Michael's own. Future through negligence and cowardice and prioritizing profit over people's lives. Grace sat on the floor of Arthur's office, surrounded by binders full of photographs and documents, and she felt grief mixing with rage, mixing with a strange kind of understanding, because Arthur's letter made terrible sense, explained things about those 6 months in hospice care that hadn't made sense at the time, explained why Arthur had been so interested in her life, so invested in understanding who she was, so desperate to hear stories about Michael, because he'd been trying to know his son. Through her, had been trying to understand what he'd missed, what he'd lost, what he'd destroyed through abandonment, and then through negligence that had killed the son he'd never bothered to claim. She thought about all the conversations they'd had, about Arthur asking about her marriage and her son and her grief, and she understood now that he'd been asking about his own son, his own grandson, his own legacy that he'd forfeited through choices that had compounded over decades into tragedy that had multiple causes, but all traced back to Arthur's original failure to be present, to be responsible, to be the kind of father who protected his child instead of creating the conditions that would eventually kill him. She called Tyler from Arthur's loft and told him to skip his afternoon classes, told him she was coming to get him, told him there was more to the story, more truth that needed sharing, more devastation that needed processing before they could decide anything about the inheritance or about Arthur's memory, or about how to move forward with knowledge that Michael's death hadn't been heroic accident but preventable tragedy caused by the father who'd spent 35 years being absent and then 3 years being secretly guilty. Tyler was waiting when she arrived at the school, and they drove to Cannon Beach, to the place where Michael had proposed, where they'd spent family vacations, where Michael had taught Tyler to bodyboard and build elaborate sandcastles and appreciate the particular beauty of Oregon coast storms, and they walked along the beach in November cold, while Grace told her son everything she'd discovered, everything Arthur's letter had revealed, everything about code violations and delayed repairs and the fire that had killed Michael because his father had valued profit over safety. Tyler didn't speak for a long time, just walked beside his mother watching waves crash against Haystack Rock, and when he finally broke the silence, he said something Grace hadn't expected, said that he was glad to know the truth, even though the truth was terrible, because living with comfortable lies was worse than accepting hard truths, because understanding why things happened was better than believing they were random, because knowing that his father had died because of his grandfather's negligence at least meant there was someone to be angry at, someone to blame, someone who bore responsibility even if that responsibility came too late to change anything. He said he didn't know whether to accept the inheritance or refuse it, didn't know whether taking money that came from his grandfather's guilt was honoring his father's memory or betraying it, didn't know how to balance practical need against principle, security against integrity, future opportunity against past injustice. They stayed at the beach until sunset, until the November sky turned colors that seemed impossible, oranges and purples and reds that looked like the world was burning softly, beautifully, the way fires looked from a distance when you didn't know they were destroying everything inside their radius. And Grace thought about perspective, about how tragedy looked different depending on where you stood, whether you were inside it or witnessing from safety, whether you were the one dying or the one watching someone die, whether you bore responsibility or were simply victim of someone else's failures. She told Tyler about the photographs in Arthur's loft, about the evidence that his grandfather had been present for every major moment of Michael's life, had documented everything from a distance that made surveillance look like love, that confused obsession with devotion, that demonstrated how thoroughly someone could care about another person while failing them completely. Tyler asked if they could see the loft, if Grace would take him there, and she hesitated because subjecting her son to Arthur's shrine felt cruel, felt like forcing him to witness his grandfather's particular madness. But Tyler insisted, said he needed to see it, needed to understand the full scope of what Arthur had done, how he'd lived, what his life had looked like when it was organized entirely around watching people he'd forfeited the right to know. They drove back to Portland as darkness settled over the coast highway, and Grace let them into Arthur's building, into the top-floor loft where photographs covered every wall, where evidence of surveillance filled every surface, where Arthur's obsession with Michael was displayed with the kind of comprehensive documentation that suggested mental illness or the particular broken-heartedness that came from loving someone you'd chosen not to claim. Tyler moved through the loft slowly, studying photographs, and Grace watched her son's face cycle through emotions as he saw his father's entire life displayed chronologically, as he recognized moments from family albums mixed with moments he'd never seen, candid shots that could only have been taken by someone present but hidden, someone watching from crowds or from distance or from whatever vantage points allowed Arthur to document without being discovered, without being questioned, without having to explain why he was photographing someone else's child, someone else's wedding, someone else's family. Tyler stopped in front of the photographs from the day Michael died, and he stared at them for a long time, at images of his father in turnout gear, at the burning building, at the moment of collapse, and Grace stood beside him feeling helpless, because what comfort could she possibly offer when her son was looking at documentation of his father's death, was seeing the moment captured by the grandfather who'd caused it, who'd created the emergency that had killed Michael through negligence that was now impossible to undo, to take back, to make right. Tyler asked quietly why Arthur had photographed it, why he'd stood there with a camera instead of doing something, instead of trying to help, instead of warning Michael not to enter the building, and Grace said she didn't know, said that maybe Arthur had been paralyzed by guilt, by understanding that he'd created the situation, by awareness that his son was about to die because of his failures, or maybe documentation was the only thing Arthur knew how to do, the only way he could participate in. Michael Michael's life even in its final moments, the only action available to someone who'd forfeited the right to actual involvement decades earlier when he'd chosen abandonment over responsibility. Tyler said it wasn't good enough, said that photographing wasn't loving, said that being present with a camera wasn't the same as being present as a father, as a person, as someone who valued another human being enough to prioritize their safety over documentation of their dying. They found more in Arthur's office, found the binders organized by year, and Grace showed Tyler the one from the year Michael died, showed him the documents about code violations and delayed repairs, and the fire marshal's investigation that had concluded Arthur bore civil but not criminal responsibility for the fire. Tyler read through the reports with the kind of focused intensity he'd inherited from Michael, the same expression his father had worn when studying for fire academy exams or reviewing building plans before responding to structure fires. And when he finished reading, he looked at Grace and said something that made her chest tighten, said that Arthur deserved to be punished, deserved to be held accountable, deserved to face consequences for letting his son die because of negligence that was documented, that was proven, that was sitting right here in black and white, showing that Arthur had known about the electrical problems and had chosen not to fix them in time to prevent the fire that had killed Michael and 3 children who'd also deserved better than they'd gotten from a property owner who treated their lives as acceptable risks. Grace said that Arthur was already dead, that punishment wasn't possible, that accountability couldn't reach someone who'd escaped into death before justice could be served. But Tyler said that wasn't entirely true, said that Arthur's legacy could be held accountable even if Arthur himself was gone, said that accepting the inheritance meant accepting blood money, meant profiting from the same negligence that had killed Michael, meant letting Arthur buy forgiveness through posthumous generosity when what he should have faced was prosecution, conviction, imprisonment for killing his own son through choices that prioritized profit over people's lives. Tyler said they should refuse the inheritance, should let it go to Arthur's distant relatives, or revert to the state, or disappear into whatever legal limbo unclaimed estates ended up in, should reject Arthur's attempt to make amends through money, because some things couldn't be fixed with wealth, some damages couldn't be repaired through inheritance, some failures were too fundamental to be addressed by anything except acknowledgement that they'd happened and choice not to participate in systems that rewarded negligence with the opportunity to buy redemption. But Grace thought about the practical realities of their situation, about her nursing salary that barely covered mortgage and groceries and the basic necessities of raising a teenager in an expensive city, about Tyler's college plans that would require loans and work study and probably years of debt, about the retirement she hadn't been able to save for because Michael's death had come with funeral expenses and lost income and all the hidden costs of widowhood that no one warned you about the security that $47 million would provide, the freedom from financial stress, the ability to focus on living rather than just surviving, the opportunities that money created even when that money came from terrible sources, from guilt and negligence and the liquidated assets of a man who'd failed in every way that mattered. She told Tyler that she understood his position, shared his anger, agreed that Arthur didn't deserve forgiveness and that money couldn't make amends for what he'd taken from them, but that refusing the inheritance wouldn't bring Michael back, wouldn't punish Arthur, who was beyond punishment, wouldn't change what had happened, except to ensure that Arthur's negligence destroyed not just Michael's life, but also his family's future. Tyler said that accepting the money felt like saying Arthur's version of events was acceptable, like agreeing that his surveillance and his guilt and his deathbed generosity somehow balanced the scales, like participating in the fiction that wealthy people could cause harm and then buy their way out of consequences through charitable bequests and inheritance that transformed victims into beneficiaries, that turned tragedy into transaction, that suggested everything had a price, including forgiveness for letting your son die because you didn't want to spend money on electrical repairs in a building full of poor people whose lives you didn't value appropriately. He said his father would have refused it, said Michael had been the kind of person who cared about principle more than pragmatism, who would have chosen struggling with integrity over thriving on blood money, who would have wanted his son to understand that some compromises weren't worth making, even when making them would be easier, more comfortable, more financially secure. Grace asked Tyler if he really believed that, if he really thought Michael would have wanted his family to suffer financially when there was money available that could prevent that suffering, and Tyler hesitated. And in that hesitation, Grace saw the truth, saw that her son was 16 and principled and angry, but also practical enough to recognize that refusing $47 million meant hardship, meant loans, meant limitation, meant watching his mother work herself to exhaustion for another 20 years before she could afford to retire. She said that Michael had been principled, but he'd also been practical, had been someone who understood that ideals had to be balanced against realities, that taking care of your family sometimes meant making compromises you didn't love, accepting help from sources you didn't respect, using resources that came from imperfect places because perfection wasn't available, and refusing imperfect help just meant suffering that served no purpose except making you feel morally superior while you struggled. She told Tyler about Arthur's final letter, the one she'd read in the hospice care wing, about how he'd written that the inheritance was meant for Michael, was patrimony that should have gone to his son if his son had lived, was wealth that Michael would have inherited if Arthur hadn't caused his death, and that giving it to Grace and Tyler was the closest Arthur could come to providing for Michael, to fulfilling the obligation that fathers had to their children, to ensuring that his son's family would be secure, even though his son was dead because of Arthur's failures. She said that framing felt important, felt like it transformed the inheritance from blood money into something closer to what Tyler should have received if his grandfather had been present, if Arthur had been the kind of father who acknowledged his child and supported his family and didn't create the conditions that would eventually kill him. Tyler asked what they would do with the money if they accepted it, how they would use wealth that came from such a dark source, whether spending it would feel like endorsing Arthur's choices, or whether there was some way to accept the inheritance while also rejecting Arthur's version of events, while maintaining anger at his negligence, while refusing to let posthumous generosity erase the damage he'd caused. Grace said she didn't know, said she'd been thinking about it, said that maybe they could use the money in ways that Arthur hadn't, that honored Michael instead of Arthur, that addressed the kinds of problems Arthur's negligence had created, that transformed blood money into something that actually helped people instead of just making the wealthy donor feel better about his failures. She told Tyler about an idea that had been forming, about using Arthur's inheritance to establish a foundation focused on housing safety, on ensuring that low-income properties met code requirements, on providing resources for tenants to report violations without fear of retaliation, on funding inspections and repairs in buildings where landlords prioritized profit over safety, the way Arthur had prioritized profit over the lives of his tenants, including his own son. She said they could call it the Michael Mitchell Housing Safety Foundation, could use Arthur's guilt money to prevent other families from losing fathers, to fires that shouldn't have happened, to negligence that should have been prevented, to the kind of cost-cutting that treated poor people's lives as acceptable risks because poor people didn't have lawyers or political influence or the resources to demand accountability from wealthy property owners who valued their bottom lines more than their tenants' lives. Tyler's expression shifted as he considered this, and Grace could see him working through the implications, testing whether using Arthur's money this way would constitute accepting his version of events, or whether it would actually constitute rejecting it, refusing to let Arthur's wealth sit idle, or benefit his distant relatives, or disappear into probate limbo when it could instead be deployed to prevent the kinds of deaths that Arthur had caused, to protect families that looked like theirs had. Look, before negligence had destroyed everything, Tyler said it felt right, felt like it honored his father without forgiving his grandfather, felt like it transformed tragedy into something that might prevent future tragedies, that turned inheritance into tool for change instead of just compensation for loss. that suggested Michael's death could mean something beyond grief and absence, and the hole his dying had left in their lives. But Tyler also said that using Arthur's money this way would require accepting the inheritance, would require engaging with the probate process, would require fighting off the distant relatives who were contesting the will, and that all of that would be public, would involve testimony and documentation and probably media coverage that would expose what Arthur had done, what he'd hidden, what he'd been guilty of. And Tyler asked if Grace was prepared for that, if she was ready to have Michael's death re-examined, to have the fire investigated again through the lens of Arthur's confession, to potentially trigger new legal proceedings that might reveal things about code violations and delayed repairs and negligence that the original investigation had minimized or overlooked. Grace said she didn't know if she was prepared for it, but that she was willing to face it if it meant using Arthur's wealth to create change, to prevent other families from losing what they'd lost, to ensure that Michael's death led to something beyond grief and anger and the particular helplessness that came from understanding that tragedy was preventable but hadn't been prevented. They decided together to accept the inheritance with conditions, to fight the contest from Arthur's distant relatives, to use the probate proceedings as opportunity to expose what Arthur had done and why he'd done it, to make public record of his negligence and his guilt and his confession, to ensure that accepting his money didn't mean accepting his narrative, but instead meant correcting it, reframing it, using his own words against him to demonstrate that wealthy people's attempts to buy redemption through posthumous generosity shouldn't be allowed to obscure the harm they'd caused, the lives they'd destroyed, the accountability they'd escaped by dying before justice could reach them. Grace called David Park and told him they would fight the contest, would defend Arthur's will, would testify about his confession and his responsibility for Michael's death, and the attorney was quiet for a long moment before saying that this strategy would definitely succeed in defeating the contest, but would also destroy Arthur's reputation, would make him infamous rather than sympathetic, would transform him from generous benefactor into negligent killer who tried to buy forgiveness through inheritance. And Grace said good, said that was exactly what they wanted, said that Arthur didn't deserve sympathy or the benefit of doubt or the kind of gentle treatment that wealthy people typically received, even when they'd caused tremendous harm through negligence and greed and prioritizing profit over people's lives. David Park asked if Grace and Tyler understood that exposing Arthur's role in Michael's death might trigger new investigations, might lead to civil litigation from other families affected by the fire, might result in Arthur's estate being reduced by settlements that would decrease their inheritance. And Grace said they understood, said they were willing to accept that cost if it meant truth came out, if it meant other victims could seek justice, even if that justice came from Arthur's estate rather than from Arthur himself, if it meant that accepting the inheritance didn't require them to participate in covering up what Arthur had done or pretending that his generosity somehow balanced his negligence. The attorney said he'd prepare for trial, said he'd subpoena Arthur's documents about the fire, said he'd build a case that demonstrated Arthur's competence and his genuine desire to leave his estate to Grace, while also exposing his guilt, his confession, his acknowledgement that he'd killed his own son through choices that prioritized profit over safety, and that this dual strategy would definitely win them the inheritance while simultaneously ensuring that Arthur's legacy was one of failure and guilt rather than redemption and generosity. And if this story is stirring something inside you, keep walking with me, because there are deeper truths still waiting to surface, and I don't want you to miss what comes next. The probate trial began on a cold January morning, 3 months after Arthur's death, and Grace sat at the defendant's table beside David Park, while Arthur's distant relatives filled the plaintiff's side of the courtroom, cousins and second cousins who'd never met Arthur, who'd never attended family gatherings or sent holiday cards or maintained any connection to him during the 20 years since his wife's death, but who'd appeared immediately when they learned about $47 million. that was being left to a hospice nurse instead of to them, to blood family, to people who bore Arthur's name even if they hadn't known him, hadn't cared about him, hadn't done anything to deserve inheritance except exist and share genetics with a man who died wealthy and alone. Their attorney was a woman named Sandra Morrison, who specialized in will contests, who'd built a career on challenging bequests to non-family members, who argued that caregivers exercised undue influence over vulnerable dying patients, that deathbed generosity was usually evidence of manipulation rather than genuine affection, that strangers who received large inheritances had almost certainly done something unethical to extract that wealth from people too sick or too confused or too desperate for companionship to recognize that they were being exploited. Sandra Morrison began her opening statement by painting Grace as predator, as someone who'd identified a wealthy, dying man with no close family, who'd deliberately cultivated relationship with him during his most vulnerable months, who'd used her position as healthcare worker to gain his trust and eventually manipulate him into leaving her his entire estate, while his actual family received nothing. She presented Arthur as victim, as lonely widower, who'd been targeted by a nurse, who'd recognized opportunity, who'd exploited his isolation and his fear of dying alone, who'd probably suggested the will change herself, who'd definitely known what she was doing when she spent extra time with a patient who happened to be worth $47 million. Sandra Morrison said that Grace's sudden windfall was suspicious, was inappropriate, was exactly the kind of situation that probate law was designed to prevent, that inheritance should go to family, to blood relatives, to people who'd known the deceased for years rather than months, to cousins who might not have been close to Arthur, but who represented his legacy, his lineage, his continuation beyond death. David Park's opening was different, was quieter, was built around truth rather than narrative. And he told the court that yes, Arthur Whitmore had left his estate to his hospice nurse, but that the relationship between them was more complicated than it appeared, that Grace Mitchell wasn't a stranger who'd manipulated a vulnerable patient, but was actually the widow of Arthur's son, was the mother of Arthur's grandson, was family in ways that mattered more than the genetic connection Arthur's distant cousins claimed as basis for their inheritance rights. He said the case was about a father trying to make amends for decades of absence, about a man who'd failed his son and then caused his son's death through negligence, about someone using his final act to try to provide for his son's family the way he should have provided for his son, about inheritance that was actually patrimony, delayed by 35 years and complicated by tragedy, but that represented legitimate transfer of wealth from father to son's family. The courtroom went quiet as David Park outlined what he would prove, as he described Arthur's abandonment of Michael, the surveillance photographs, the code violations that had caused the fire, the confession Arthur had written taking responsibility for his son's death, the 6 months in hospice care where Arthur had finally known his son through the woman Michael had loved, and Grace watched the distant relatives' faces shift from confident to confused to alarmed as they understood that their case was about to expose family secrets they'd known nothing about, was about to make public a scandal that would destroy Arthur's reputation while simultaneously strengthening Grace's claim to his inheritance. Grace testified first, described meeting Arthur in hospice care, the conversations they'd had, the friendship that had developed, and she was honest about not knowing Arthur was Michael's father, about having no idea that the patient she was caring for had any connection to her, about being as shocked as anyone when the inheritance was revealed and Arthur's identity became clear. Sandra Morrison's cross-examination was aggressive, suggested that Grace must have known, must have researched her patient, must have discovered his wealth and his connection to Michael, and deliberately cultivated relationship to position herself for inheritance. But Grace's testimony was consistent, was supported by hospital records showing she'd been randomly assigned to Arthur's care, was backed by witnesses who confirmed she'd had no prior knowledge of Arthur's identity or his relationship to Michael. David Park introduced Arthur's letters into evidence, the confession about the fire, the explanation of his surveillance, the photographs from the loft, and the courtroom watched a slideshow of images showing Michael's entire life, documented by a father who'd never acknowledged him, who'd attended major moments from hiding, who'd photographed his son's death from the crowd while firefighters tried to rescue him from a building that was burning because of code violations Arthur had failed to address. The impact was devastating, made Arthur's distant relatives visibly uncomfortable, made Sandra Morrison request a recess to consult with her clients, made clear that fighting this inheritance meant defending a man whose negligence had killed his own son, whose guilt was documented, whose attempt at redemption through inheritance might be inadequate but was at least genuine, was at least based on actual relationship rather than distant genetic connection. Tyler testified next. Grace's 16-year-old son, who spoke with the kind of controlled fury that came from loss processed over 3 years, from grief that had hardened into understanding that his father's death had been preventable, that his grandfather had caused it, that the inheritance being contested was actually his father's patrimony being transferred to him through his mother because his father was dead, because of the man whose estate was being fought over. Tyler said he didn't want his grandfather's money, said Arthur didn't deserve forgiveness or the opportunity to buy redemption through posthumous generosity, but that his mother had convinced him that refusing the inheritance meant letting Arthur's negligence continue to harm them, meant choosing principle over security, meant suffering to prove a point that would only make their lives harder without actually punishing anyone who deserved punishment. He testified about the plan to use the inheritance to create the Michael Mitchell Housing Safety Foundation, to deploy Arthur's wealth to prevent the kinds of fires that had killed his father, to ensure that other families didn't lose what his family had lost because property owners prioritized profit over safety, because code violations went unaddressed, because negligence was treated as acceptable cost of doing business rather than as criminal disregard for tenants' lives. Sandra Morrison objected, argued that Tyler's testimony about future plans for the inheritance was irrelevant to the question of whether Arthur had been competent when executing his will, but the judge allowed it, ruled that Arthur's intentions were relevant to determining whether Grace's inheritance was legitimate bequest or result of undue influence. David Park called witnesses from hospice care, nurses and doctors who'd interacted with Arthur during his final months, who testified that he'd been lucid and competent, that he'd understood his medical situation, that he'd been capable of making decisions about his care and his estate, that there had been no signs of confusion or diminished capacity that would suggest vulnerability to manipulation. They testified that Arthur had seemed focused on Grace, had asked for her specifically, had scheduled his medication and his rest periods around her shifts so he could maximize time with her, but that his interest had seemed based on genuine connection rather than inappropriate attachment, had seemed like someone seeking understanding, seeking relationship, seeking something that had nothing to do with whether Grace was providing excellent care and everything to do with who she was, who she'd been married to, what she could tell him about the son he'd never known. The defense rested, and Sandra Morrison called Arthur's cousins to testify, but their testimony was weak, was based on childhood memories of family gatherings decades ago, on Christmas cards that had stopped coming after Arthur's wife died, on funerals and weddings they'd attended together back when Arthur had still participated in family events before isolation had consumed him, before guilt about Michael had made him withdraw from everyone. They testified that they'd been shocked to learn Arthur had a biological son, had never heard him mention Michael, had no idea he'd had a child he'd abandoned, and their shock was genuine, but it also undermined their case because it demonstrated that they'd known nothing about Arthur's actual life, his actual history, his actual family that consisted of son and grandson they'd never heard about because Arthur had kept those relationships secret, had maintained surveillance from distance, had failed everyone, including the cousins, who were now claiming they deserved his estate despite having no real connection to him beyond genetics and distant memory. The judge ruled from the bench, said she'd reviewed the evidence and found that Arthur Whitmore had been competent when executing his will, that his decision to leave his estate to Grace Mitchell was based on genuine relationship rather than undue influence, that the existence of biological family didn't override a testator's right to choose beneficiaries based on connection, history, and desire to provide for people who mattered to him. She ruled that Grace would inherit the full estate, that Arthur's distant relatives would receive nothing, and that the probate proceedings had successfully established not just the validity of Arthur's will, but also the truth about his relationship to Grace, his responsibility for Michael's death, his guilt, and his attempt at redemption that came too late to save anyone, but might at least provide resources for his son's family to build something meaningful from tragedy. But the judge added something unexpected, said that the evidence presented during trial suggested that Arthur Whitmore's property company might have been criminally negligent in maintaining the building where the fire occurred, that the code violations and delayed repairs might warrant reopening the fire marshal's investigation, that families of the other victims deserved opportunity to seek justice through civil litigation now that Arthur's confession had been made public record, and she was referring the matter to the district attorney's office for review of whether charges could be filed against Arthur's estate, against the property management company, against anyone who'd been involved in the decision to delay electrical repairs that had contributed to the fire. Grace felt something like satisfaction at this ruling, felt that accountability was finally reaching Arthur, even if it came posthumously, even if it meant his estate might be reduced by settlements, even if justice was imperfect and delayed, but at least present. She left the courthouse with Tyler and David Park, and they stood on the steps in January rain while journalists asked questions about the inheritance and the fire and Arthur's confession, and Grace answered honestly, said that Arthur Whitmore had been a failure as father and as human being, that his negligence had killed his son and 3 children who deserved better, that his wealth couldn't compensate for that harm, but could at least be used to prevent similar tragedies, could at least be deployed toward housing safety and tenant advocacy, and the kinds of systemic changes that might keep other families intact, might save other firefighters from dying in preventable fires, might honor Michael's memory by ensuring his death led to something beyond grief and anger, and the particular helplessness that came from understanding that tragedy was preventable but hadn't been prevented until someone with resources decided prevention mattered more than profit. The Michael Mitchell Housing Safety Foundation launched in the spring, 6 months after the probate ruling, and Grace stood in a community center in southeast Portland, surrounded by tenants and advocates and housing organizers who'd spent years fighting slumlords and negligent property owners and the systems that allowed poor people's homes to deteriorate while landlords extracted rent without maintaining basic safety standards. She told them about Michael, about the fire that had killed him, about Arthur's negligence and his confession, and the inheritance that would now fund their work, would provide resources for inspections and repairs and legal advocacy, would ensure that tenants had support when reporting code violations, would create accountability where profit motive had previously incentivized ignoring problems until they became disasters. Tyler spoke too, Grace's son, who was 17 now and heading to college in the fall, and he told the assembled crowd that his father had died being a hero, but that heroes shouldn't be necessary, that fires shouldn't happen because of deferred maintenance, that firefighters shouldn't have to risk their lives fixing problems that property owners should have prevented, and that his grandfather's money was going to be used to make Michael's death mean something beyond individual tragedy, to transform one family's loss into systemic change that might prevent other families from experiencing what they'd experienced. He said it felt right, felt like honoring his father without excusing his grandfather, felt like using blood money to wash some of the blood away, to create something clean from something deeply stained, to build protection for vulnerable people from the wealth that had been extracted from vulnerable people through negligence and profit-seeking, and the casual cruelty of treating poor tenants as less deserving of safety than wealthy ones. The foundation's first project was renovating the apartment building where the fire had occurred, the one Arthur had owned, the one where code violations had killed Michael and 3 children, and Grace insisted on this despite advice that it was too painful, too personal, too much like revisiting trauma that should be left behind. But she said that leaving the building as it was felt like accepting that the fire had been inevitable, that tragedy was just something that happened rather than something created by specific choices that could be examined and corrected. And she wanted the renovation to be thorough, wanted it to become model for what buildings could be when owners prioritized tenant safety, wanted families to live there without fear that electrical problems or structural issues or any other deferred. Maintenance would cost them their homes or their lives. The renovation took 8 months, gutted the building down to studs and brick, replaced every system that had been neglected, installed safety features that exceeded code requirements, and Grace was there frequently, watching the work, talking to contractors, ensuring that nothing was half done or deferred or treated as optional expense that could be eliminated to save money. She thought about Arthur during those visits, wondered if he'd felt anything during those months before the fire, when inspectors were flagging violations, when tenants were complaining about electrical problems, when decisions were being made to delay repairs that would have prevented everything that followed. She wondered if he'd thought about the families living in his building, if he'd considered that they were human beings who deserved safety, or if they'd been abstract to him, numbers on spreadsheets, rent payments that funded his wealth without requiring him to think too hard about where that wealth came from, who provided it, what conditions they lived in while generating his profit. Tyler visited the building on the day the renovation was completed, walked through apartments that had been transformed from neglected to beautiful, from dangerous to safe, from places where families had lived in fear to spaces where children could grow up without their parents worrying that the walls might catch fire, or the stairs might collapse, or the electrical system might fail in ways that killed everyone while they slept. He stood in the 3rd floor unit where the fire had started, where electrical problems had ignited, where his father had been when the building collapsed, and he said something that made Grace's throat tighten, said that this was his father's grave, that this space held Michael's last moments, that renovation had transformed it from place of death into place of life, but that the transformation didn't erase what had happened, didn't make the tragedy disappear, just acknowledged it and tried to ensure it never happened again. Grace had commissioned a memorial for the building's entrance, a bronze plaque that listed the names of everyone who died in the fire, Michael Mitchell and 3 children whose lives had been cut short by negligence, by profit-seeking, by the choices that Arthur Whitmore had made, and that the Michael Mitchell Housing Safety Foundation existed to prevent anyone else from making. The plaque included a quote from Michael that Tyler had found in his father's journals, something Michael had written after a particularly difficult fire. Every building is someone's home. Every home is someone's life. Every life is worth protecting, regardless of rent paid or address claimed. D. Grace thought the quote captured something essential about Michael, about his understanding that service meant treating everyone as valuable, everyone as deserving of safety, everyone as mattering regardless of socio-economic status or property value or any other metric that suggested some lives were worth more than others. The foundation expanded its work beyond Portland, began funding similar projects in other cities, partnering with tenant organizations and housing advocates and local governments that were willing to prioritize safety over property owners' profits, that were willing to enforce codes strictly, that were willing to hold landlords accountable when they failed to maintain buildings properly. Grace left nursing after the first year, devoted herself full-time to the foundation, and she found that the work work was healing in ways she hadn't expected, that fighting to prevent other families from losing what she'd lost was the only form of grief processing that actually helped, that felt productive rather than simply destructive, that transformed pain into purpose, tragedy into meaning, loss into something that might save lives, even if it couldn't restore the life she'd lost. She thought about Arthur sometimes, wondered what he'd think about the foundation, whether he'd be proud or ashamed or some mixture of both, whether he'd understand that his inheritance had been transformed into exactly the kind of work he should have been doing while alive, the kind of attention to safety he should have been paying when he owned properties, the kind of care for tenants' lives he should have been exercising when making decisions about repair budgets and code violations, and whether profit mattered more than people. She'd never forgiven him, wasn't sure forgiveness was appropriate or possible or even desirable when someone's failures were as comprehensive as Arthur's had been, but she'd made peace with using his money, had reconciled herself to the idea that accepting blood money was justified when that money was being used to stop bleeding, to prevent future bloodshed, to create safety from the profits of negligence. Tyler graduated high school and chose to study engineering, said he wanted to design buildings that couldn't fail the way the building that had killed his father had failed, wanted to create systems that made safety automatic rather than optional, that didn't rely on property owners' goodwill or inspectors' diligence or tenants' ability to advocate for themselves when systems were failing around them. Grace was proud of this choice, recognized that Tyler was processing his father's death through purpose the same way she was, that building things that protected people was how both of them honored Michael's memory, how they kept him present, how they ensured his death had meaning beyond individual tragedy, beyond loss, beyond the grief that still surfaced at unexpected moments but was now contained within larger framework of working to prevent others from experiencing what they'd experienced. On the 3rd anniversary of Michael's death, Grace and Tyler went to the renovated apartment building, stood in front of the memorial plaque, and they talked about Michael not as hero who died, but as person who'd lived, who'd chosen service, who'd been present and engaged and committed to making the world safer through his work, and they acknowledged that Arthur's inheritance had enabled them to continue Michael's work in ways Michael hadn't been able to continue himself, that the foundation was Michael's legacy as much as theirs, that using Arthur's guilt and wealth to create change was the closest thing to justice they could construct from tragedy that had been preventable but hadn't been prevented until it was too late to save anyone, but might at least be early enough to save someone, to keep another family intact, to prevent another firefighter from dying, fixing a problem that never should have existed. Grace stood with her son in the spring sunlight that broke through Portland's perpetual clouds, and she thought about inheritance, about what gets passed down through generations, about how Arthur's abandonment of Michael had created Michael's commitment to presence, about how Arthur's negligence had killed Michael, but had also created resources that would prevent similar deaths, about how tragedy could be transformed into meaning, not through forgetting or forgiving, but through refusing to let. Suffering be wasted through deploying pain toward prevention, through building from wreckage something that might shelter others from the storms that had destroyed you. She hadn't forgiven Arthur, hadn't excused his failures, hadn't accepted his version of redemption, but she'd taken his inheritance and transformed it into Michael's memorial, and that felt right. Felt like the only adequate response to being given blood money by someone whose blood had killed your husband, whose guilt had funded your future, whose final gift had been inadequate and appropriate in equal measure, insufficient to restore what had been lost, but sufficient to prevent some future losses, to honor one man's death by protecting other people's lives, to turn inheritance into shield rather than sword, protection rather than profit, safety rather than the negligence that had made that safety necessary. Before you go, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story, because each week a new hidden truth rises to the surface, and I want you with me for every twist.